Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about how to create the API test cases. We will discuss about the functional test cases and how we can write the test scenarios so that we can create the better test cases from the API documentation. So will create our API functional test cases using the three steps which we will follow. The first step we will look at what to look in the API documentation, what test actions we have to perform on the API, and the third about we will talk about with an example that the example API, and we will write the basic test scenarios for it. So if I say what is API documentation? API documentation, it is just similar to a manual, reference manual, which talk about the information of an API. Here you will understand that what are the available endpoints, what are their methods. When I'm talking about HTTP methods, it means they are get, post, put, delete, patch. We will see that if there is any functionality which is missing or duplicate, we can identify from the API documentation. We can also understand the relationship between the API and their resources. Here resources means like the JSON request payload resources or the content type. These are the multiple resources we are creating. So these things we can understood from the API. Apart from that, we can also check the response code, that what are the expected response code. These are the things we have to look in the API documentations. Okay, so for today, if we talk about the test actions which we have to perform on an API, so we have to follow like HTTP status code. We have to check for each and every API that the status code should be correct. It should be matched with the API documentation. For example, if we are creating a resource and in the API documentation for creating a resource, it should give you 201. If you are unauthorized for something, then it should give you 401. If you are forbidden, then it should give you 403. So like these things you have to validate in the HTTP status code. Then you have to validate the response payload. In the response payload, you can check the valid JSON body which is as expected with the API documentation. You can also check the error response message in the response payload body. Okay, so if you are doing some testing with invalid input, so obviously the error response would come in the response payload, so it should also be defined in the API documentation, and you have to perform these test actions on an API. Then you have to validate the response headers. What are response headers? Response headers like cache, connection type. So these are the different response headers which are coming, and you have to validate that it should not impact the performance of an API or the security of an API. The last, according to me, is the performance. Okay, so performance is very required. Okay, suppose here we are not doing the performance testing, we are talking about the basic performance. Suppose you are creating some resource using your API, so it should give you the response in a reasonable amount of time. It does not take a much time to solve the to means provide you the response. So these are the things we have to focus on when we have to perform the testing on an API. So for today, we will take these endpoints for the test scenarios, and in these endpoints I have written methods, endpoints, and description. So like post, get, put, and delete, these are the four methods we are taking for today example. And if we are taking a post employee, it means it will create employee. Then we have a get employee, it means it is getting all employees using sorting or pagination or field. These are the query parameters: sorting, pagination, and field. Then we have a get employee name, that you can get the employee by a name using the get API. Then we have put, update employee by ID. Then we have a delete employee by ID. So these are the five different endpoints for which I will just take these five endpoints as an example for today's video. And let's understand now the test scenarios. So first of all, if I just divided the test scenarios into 5 part. First is happy test scenarios. It means we will execute them with only with the required parameters. Then we have a happy test scenarios. That means that we will execute them with all the parameters, whether it is required or whether it should be optional. Then we will do the negative testing, but with the valid inputs type, and then we will do the negative testing with invalid inputs type, and then at the end we can do the destructive testing. So like this is the P0 priority, and then this is the next priority, and then this, and then this, and then this. So we have to follow the similar way whenever we have to test the API. If I am talking about happy test scenarios with all the required parameters, so for example, we have taken these 5 endpoints, right? So suppose you are creating an employee, and in that employee there is a request body in which not all the parameters are mandatory. Okay, when I'm saying all the parameters, so for example, there is a request payload, and in that request payload there are two mobile number. Okay, but only one mobile number is mandatory. Second mobile number is optional. So just create the employee first of all with only mandatory values, with only mandatory query parameters. Okay, and then check the response. So you have to check that the request should return the same status code which is expected as per the API documentation. When I'm talking about this happy test scenario, I'm talking for all the API. So you have to perform you have to first of all test this API with the required parameters. Then you have to test this API with the required parameters. Just don't pass any query parameters, sorting, pagination, or field. Just directly hit the API. Then you have to get the employee name by a name, and then you have to get the update the employee by ID, and then you have to delete the employee by ID. So these are the P0 scenarios, or smoke scenarios, which we have to perform whenever you will get an API for testing. After that, just check that the response body JSON payload is correct. It should match with the API documentation. It should match the schema. Whatever the schema it is mentioned in the API documentation, it should be there. Suppose you are creating a resource. Okay, suppose you are creating an employee, and then it is providing you an additional value in the response payload which is not written in the API documentation. So just validate these things. Might be there is some missing functionality. There are some missing fields in the JSON. So just validate, and all these things are only for mandatory parameters or all the required parameters. Just check that the field and its type. Okay, if we are just sending the boolean value, then it should not be like in a string. Okay, might be sometimes what happens that we just write there is a boolean value, for example, um, as for example, just take that that do you have two mobile numbers. Okay, then it should be the true or false, right? But sometimes user take this in a string instead of boolean. So just check the field and its type as well in the response JSON. So these are the happy test scenarios which you have to perform in terms of JSON payload. Just validate the response headers, that the response header should be the content set should be JSON if we are expecting a JSON. If we are expecting an HTML, then content type should be HTML. If we are expecting a text, then the content type should be text. Check the connection should be alive. Check the cache control. Check the access control allow origin. So these things would help you to know about the performance and the security. And at the end, with these happy test scenario, just check the reasonable expected time that you are expecting that it should take this amount of time. Suppose you are creating an employee and you are expecting that it should not take more than 5 seconds, and it suppose it took around 20 or 30 seconds, then it is not reasonable. Just try that. Okay, and if you feel that the performance is slow in one or two tests, so just you can report that thing in a function in a performance part. But this is not about the performance testing or not about the non-functional testing. Here we are talking about the functional one. Now when we just test all these functionality, then just check the functionality with required and optional parameters. When we are talking about the required and optional parameters, so suppose as I mentioned that there are two mobile numbers in the request body. Okay, so just pass all the valid body, just entire body which is you are expecting, whether it is required or not. Just check that you are able to create a resource at the end. Then you can just check the get employee using sorting, that the sorting functionality is working fine, it is providing you the resource according to the sorting you are expecting. You can write the pagination. Suppose you have 1,000 of employees, okay, and you are expecting that if I am writing pagination in my query parameter and I am writing 10, then it should only return the 10 employees to me instead of 1,000. And you can also put the sorting put the query parameter on the field value. So these are the things which you can cover in part of required plus optional parameters. And like these are the things in which there is no optional parameter. So just test whatever you have created here, it should be visible in that, and all the parameters which you have written in the post request like should be visible in get employee name. And if you try to update a employee id which is not mandatory, okay, suppose if you would like to update something which is not mandatory, then you can use the port and delete. So these are the things which you have to perform. So just perform with required and optional parameters. Then we have a negative testing for the valid input. So for example, what you can do here, suppose for example I just wrote that create an employee which already exists, okay, and you can just perform that delete the employee which you already deleted, right, because that is not possible to delete that specific employee. Then update the employee with the illegal valid data, for example age. Suppose you are expecting that in your company the minimum age is 20 and the maximum age is suppose 60. Then you can check with 19 age and see that whether you are able to create a resource. But 19 is a valid number, right? It is not an invalid, so you can just check these things. Then you can delete or create the employee without permission. If there is any authorization or authentication in the request, so you can just check that using in the negative testing valid inputs. And when I'm saying about the negative testing valid inputs, so just make sure that the happy test scenarios which we have discussed here about the or which we have discussed here, the status code, response payload, response headers, and basic performance. So these things we have to check in every scenario, in every test scenario, okay. Then we have a negative testing of invalid input. What invalid input means here is that suppose you have to delete a resource or you have to create a resource, but for that there are two types of authorization. So first is that you are an admin, or second is you are not an admin, you only have a read access, okay, you don't have a write access. So just try with that, and try with that read access token and see that are you able to create a resource or not, okay. So ideally you should not have, okay. And then you can try that if you don't pass any authorization token, then what is happening, how's the api is returning. So it's all the things you have to validate, these four things: status code, payload, headers, and performance. Because if you try to create if you try to create a resource and you don't have access, so you should get 403, okay, and the error should come in the response payload, okay. So just validate these things in the invalid input. Then we have a destructive testing. It's like sometimes we try to do monkey or exploratory testing, just try with the empty payload, and you are expecting that name should be less than 100 characters. So just write down the big name and see how it is showing in the get request. Just try with invalid request payload, just remove the mandatory parameters from the request payload and see how the response is coming. So it's like a exploratory testing which you have to perform on the API. So according to me, these five scenarios cover most of the test cases if we perform them accordingly, and it would help us to identify the P0 P1 bugs in an early stage if we just solve or test the API with accordingly. Just first of all we will do with the required parameters, then we will do with the required plus optional parameters, then we will do the valid input negative testing, then we do invalid input negative testing, and then we at the end we do destructive testing. Sometimes what happens, whenever we got the API for testing, we start directly with the destructive testing. So just go step by step, and then just create the test cases accordingly, and it would help you to write or execute the better test cases, and you will find the defects in an early phase. So just make sure all these things all these scenarios you will write or execute whenever you have to perform on an API site. If I say on the API documentation part again, then in the API documentation part, just make sure that whatever things are written should be matched and should be expected. Okay, and the response status code and content type, many of the things are written for an API documentation. You can refer to Swagger or the Open API reference, which many companies uses. Some of them are also using Confluence to write the API documentation. So these are the things which you have to follow. So that's all from my end today. If you have any additional test scenarios, please write down in the comment section, which would help me to understand and learn from you guys as well. So just write down in the comment section. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe to my channel to make YouTube Baba happy. So that's all from my end. Thank you everyone.